Welcome everyone to another exciting episode of Mr. Etzel Cooks. And today's show we're going to be making butter cookies. As always, you want to clean your countertop before we get started. You don't want any crumbs, any hair, any dirt that was on your counter getting into your cookies. Now do we? No, we don't. So let's get the tools we're going to need. We're going to use a large Pyrex bowl and a wooden spoon, specifically the back side of a wooden spoon. We're also going to be using a spatula, which I'll bring out later. At this point in the process, we're going to be practicing the creaming method. Now generally in YouTube videos online, they'll use an electronic mixer to do the creaming method. We're going to be using the back side of a spoon, which works just as well, but it does take a lot of effort. So as you can see with the creaming method, you're going to be using the back side of a wooden spoon. So I've got my butter here, and I've let this rest out at room temperature for a little over an hour. A couple hours wouldn't hurt. And what this does is it makes the butter soft so that when you do the creaming process, the sugars that you're going to dissolve into the butters can actually get into the butter. If the butter was cold, fresh out of the fridge, you'd have a really hard time doing that, and the sugars would not dissolve. I'm going to open up the butter here a little bit, which will increase the temperature of the butter slightly, because as you're mixing it around, you're creating some energy there, which is going to raise the temperature a little bit, but it's not going to melt the butter, because you don't want to use melted butter for the creaming process. That won't work either. So what this does is just heats up the butter a little bit, and then I can add in my sugars here so that my sugars can dissolve into the butter. So why are we doing this? Well, one of the many reasons you would want to cream your butters and your sugar together first is so that air, as the sugars dissolve into the butter, will create little air pockets, which will help your cookies have a really nice texture of some air pockets inside as you eat them. As I'm doing this process, I'm using the back of the wooden spoon to kind of push the sugar into the butter as I'm hitting it against the side of the bowl there. I don't necessarily stir, I'm just kind of like pushing the sugar into the butter, and your hand is going to get really tired, almost like carpal tunnel. So just take your time to do this. About 3 to 4 minutes of doing this should give you a product that looks about like that. And I'm using my spatula to scrape off the wooden spoon there. And I'm then going to use my spatula to scrape down the sides of the bowl, just kind of creating everything into a pile. It's time now to incorporate our egg and vanilla, so I'm going to crack my egg there on the countertop. I'm going to open it, and that egg yolk and egg white are going to drop right in there. Now if you do get any shell in there, you're going to want to pick that out. You can use the side of the eggshell to scoop that out there. And I'm going to add in my vanilla. Now this is real vanilla extract. If you don't have vanilla extract, you can buy the imitation kind. The flavors are fairly similar. And I'm going to mix this around. Now at this point you can kind of stir it together. Basically what you want to do is you want to incorporate that egg into our butter mixture there so that it does look the same throughout. As you're mixing it from this camera angle, it does look like scrambled eggs that are not cooked. When you are done, it should look something like this. And now I'm going to set this aside and we're going to work on our dry ingredients. Whenever you're baking cookies, it's really important that you do your dry ingredients separate and get everything mixed together ahead of time, or do them in a separate bowl like I'm doing here. So I've got my flour and my baking powder in there, as well as my pinch of salt. A pinch of salt is just a little bit of salt. It's about 1/16 if you have that measuring spoon, but you can just take your 1/8 and fill it up halfway. That'd be 1/16, about a pinch of salt. And I'm using a whisk to just get everything incorporated throughout so that it's ready to go when we add them to our wet ingredients, which we're going to do right here. So I'm going to add my flour in there, dump it all in there, and I got my wooden spoon, and I'm going to use the back of the wooden spoon to just kind of push everything in there together. Now there's not much moisture here, so it's going to take a little bit of time, and you're just going to be kind of working that dry flour, the baking powder, and the salt into the butter mixture there. It's going to kind of start to resemble a pie crust. And you can start off using your wooden spoon, but you are going to switch eventually to using your hands. I don't know if you like using your hands when you're doing some baking, but this is like a pie crust and there's almost no moisture there. And so we really need to use our hands to incorporate it. It works a lot easier than using a utensil like a wooden spoon for this point. And so I'm just kind of mashing it on top of each other. Now I'm adding some milk as my moisture, and depending on the temperature of that day, the humidity, you may need to add more or less milk. It's just you're kind of looking for a cookie dough consistency, one that is pliable, malleable, but it's not too liquidy. And mine is still pretty dry, so let me add a little bit more milk. That looks like it should do the trick. I'm just going to keep working at it and incorporating it all in there. This is exactly the texture I'm looking for. It is tacky, but it doesn't stick to your hands. At this point, we need to get it ready for the fridge because we are going to chill our dough. So you're going to use either parchment paper or wax paper so that it doesn't stick. I'm doing this twice, as indicated by my fingers there. And so before we do that, we got to roll our logs. So I floured my surface there. I'm going to roll this out into a large log, almost like a loaf. I'm going to cut it in half, and then I'm going to roll this one out as well. And you want it to be about 2 inches in diameter. Do the same for the other loaf. I've got my 2 loaves here. They should be about the same in size, give or take, and we're going to wrap them in our paper. The reason why we're chilling them in the refrigerator is because while the dough is chilling, the butter will chill as well. And if you use chilled butter, that is what we want as we are baking our cookies, and it's going to come off with a better texture and consistency for inside the cookie. So while the dough is chilling in the fridge, let's work on the glaze. We are going to be cutting our lemon to get the juice out. We need to do knife safety. So using a cutting board, put a wet rag underneath so the cutting board does not slip. I'm using a small paring knife, making one cut across the middle of the lemon. I have my 2 lemon wedges. And now I'm using a juicer to get the juice out of my lemon wedges, but if you didn't have that, no worries. You could just squeeze your lemons and collect the seeds and the pulp. I am a huge fan of adding lemon to cookies and quick breads, and I just think it gives a really, really nice taste with the sweetness. If you didn't want to do that, you didn't have to. Here's my butter. I'm actually going to melt it in the microwave for about 6 seconds because I need some fat that I'm going to be adding to my glaze. Some glaze recipes don't call for fat. The one I'm using does, because it kind of gives a creamier, velvety texture. So I got my powdered sugar in a bowl. I'm going to add in my fat, my butter, and I'm also going to add in my lemon juice and a little bit of milk, just a little bit. And you can kind of keep the milk on the side. And that way, if your glaze is too dry, you can add some milk. If your glaze is too liquidy, you just add more powdered sugar and you mix accordingly until you get the glaze that you want. And of course, it's going to look really liquidy. It takes about 30 minutes to dry on each cookie later when we glaze it, so don't worry about that. Go ahead and set your oven to 400 degrees. We are going to make our first test cookie. Now I'm only going to cook 1 cookie for the first test cookie, so I'm going to butter my tray, but I'm only going to butter it where I'm going to put that test cookie, right there in the middle. And keep in mind, because we are making our 1 test cookie, it's going to give us kind of an indication of how things are going to go. But as you put more things in your oven, if I go from 1 cookie to 12 cookies, the temperature needed to heat those cookies is going to change. So just keep that in mind. So, for example, I cut off the edges there of the cookie dough log thingy, and I'm going to make this about the width of my fingernail. Now, I like my cookies to be really thick. You might like yours to be thinner. If you make your cookies thinner, they're going to be kind of crisp, almost like a cracker, but by making them thicker, the outside will be crisp and the inside will be soft, which makes an excellent consistency. So I'm going to put that right there in the middle of the tray and off to the ovens. My oven is a gas oven, so the time that it takes to bake this cookie was about 8 minutes. The test cookie has been finished out of the oven. Let's take a look. The bottom here is, the top looks great. The top has set. You can see everything is set in the middle, and the bottom is brown. A little bit browner than I would like it to be. However, as mentioned earlier, in our next batch, because you're going to be cooking a lot more in the oven, the heat is going to dissipate, and that is not going to happen. So I've got my sheet here, and I'm going to use my butter like a glue stick. This is actually my favorite part of the recipe. Kind of reminds me of being in first grade using a glue stick for a project. I'm just going to glue stick that whole sheet. Now that the sheet is ready to go, I've got my log of cookie dough. My other log is still chilling in the fridge because I don't want it to heat up. And again, I'm going to cut these to the width of my desire, which is about the size of my index fingernail. And so I'm going to cut that using a bench scraper. You could use a knife, but just something that can make a wedge between the dough. And so I'm going to assemble these onto my cookie sheet, spread out about an inch between. They will not spread when you're baking them as much as like a chocolate chip cookie, so you don't have to worry about them getting stuck together. Rinse and repeat for your second sheet. However, you're only going to be cooking one sheet at a time. Once they have finished baking and they are out of the oven, let's take a look. So we've got our first pan done here. Those ugly looking ones were kind of the ends. So I'll eat those. I won't present those to my guests. I'm gonna let this cool on the tray for about 2 minutes. After 2 minutes of cooling on the cookie sheet, I'm gonna move them to the cookie rack. This is gonna let some airflow from up underneath, and it's gonna help them to finish the cooling process. We want our cookies to be very cool before we add the glaze to them. You see the bottom there looks great. It's not as burnt as in the test cookie. So they've been chilling there for about a half hour. They're about room temperature. And now I'm going to add my glaze. Different people like to do different things. You can use the whisk to kind of drape it over the top, but I like maximum glaze. So I'm going to drop my cookies actually into the glaze, take them out, and then set them on my cookie rack, which is going to allow the glaze to dry. Now my glaze took about 45 minutes to harden. If you start stacking these cookies up before that glaze has hardened, you're going to kind of have a mess, and the presentation isn't going to be as good.